Long before they carved a kingdom along the sun-drenched coast of North Africa, the Vandals were just another mysterious tribe roaming the edges of Rome's known world. Mention the word Vandal today, and most imagine reckless destroyers, barbarians smashing Roman statues, torching libraries, and leaving nothing but chaos in their wake. But this image is a creation, carefully shaped, sharpened, and embedded into Western memory by their Roman enemies. The truth, as always, is far more complex. The Vandals likely originated in the region of modern-day Poland, part of the larger East Germanic group. They lived as semi-nomadic pastoralists and warriors. Roman authors first mentioned them in the 2nd century AD, but the Vandals themselves left few written records. Their early story is cloaked in the fog of oral tradition and the silence of lost voices. What we do know is that by the 3rd century, they were beginning to press southward, drawn, like so many others, to wealth, land, and relative order of the Roman world. In those chaotic centuries, as Rome weakened from civil wars, border pressures, and internal decay, tribes like the Vandals became both threat and necessity. Sometimes they were raiders, sometimes allies, sometimes settlers, but always outsiders. Their relationship with Rome was fluid, transactional, and often violent. But here's the twist. The Vandals were not uniquely destructive. In fact, compared to others, their violence was targeted and strategic. What truly set them apart wasn't senseless mayhem. It was their success. They didn't just raid Roman lands. They took them. They didn't just sack cities. They ruled them, and that made them dangerous in ways Rome couldn't forgive. So, how did this tribe, obscure and scattered, rise to become a Mediterranean power? How did their kings build a dynasty that ruled North Africa for nearly a century? And why, despite that power, do we barely remember them today? The story of the Vandal kings is one of ambition, brilliance, and erasure, a kingdom born of migration, forged in war, and forgotten through deliberate rewriting of history. It begins with a long and brutal journey, a crossing of rivers, mountains, and seas that would change not only their fate, but the very map of a dying empire. As we move forward, we'll follow the footsteps of these so-called barbarians through frozen frontiers, crumbling Roman provinces, and into the glittering halls of Carthage. We'll uncover the lives of kings like Gaiseric and Thrasimund, men who outwitted emperors and built a new world from the ashes of the old. And perhaps, by the end, you'll see why the Vandals were not forgotten because they were unimportant, but precisely because they mattered too much, because they dared to claim what Rome believed was eternal, because they ruled, and that was the greatest sin of all. In the winter of 406 AD, Europe froze. Rivers that normally surged and churned with the lifeblood of the continent turned to ice. For the Vandals, huddled in the wilds of Germania, this was not merely a season. It was an opportunity. The Rhine, that mighty border that had protected the Western Roman Empire for centuries, had turned into a bridge, and across it, the Vandals marched. They were not alone. Alongside them came the Alans, a nomadic Iranian people, and the Suebi, fellow Germanic tribesmen. Together, this coalition of desperation and ambition surged into the heart of Gaul. For Rome, it was a disaster and a clear sign that the Western Empire's grip was breaking. The barbarian invasion of 406 wasn't a blitzkrieg of war-hungry savages. It was a mass migration, men, women, children, and warriors, driven by hunger, pressure from the Huns, and dreams of land. The Vandals were divided into two groups. The Hasdingi, led by King Carthage, and the Silingi, a more obscure branch. When they crossed the Rhine near Mainz, they were entering a devastated Roman province already teetering. The empire, stretched too thin, had left Gaul undermanned and underfunded. The invaders pillaged where they could, but more often they took what Rome would not give: food, shelter, and land. Gaiseric was killed early on, possibly in battle with the Franks, but his son, Gaiseric, took command. He was a shrewd and aggressive leader, steering the Vandals further southwest into Hispania. By 409 AD, the Vandals had entered the Iberian Peninsula, a land rich in resources and rife with internal Roman collapse. There, they carved out temporary settlements. The Hasdingi took Galicia, the Silingi, Baetica. But these were not peaceful arrangements. They were marked by constant battles with local Roman forces, other barbarian tribes, and one another. At this point, a new figure began to rise, Gaiseric, Gunderic's half-brother. Sharp-witted, ruthless, and born to a concubine, Gaiseric was an unlikely heir. But he watched. He learned. He waited. Under Gunderic, the Vandals fought the Visigoths, contended with Roman intrigue, and watched as Hispania became a chessboard of competing powers. In 428, when Gunderic died, possibly from illness or battle wounds, Gaiseric seized power. And then, in a bold and fateful move, Gaiseric turned his eyes south. Why struggle in a war-torn peninsula when a jewel waited across the sea? That jewel was Roman Africa, the breadbasket of the Western Empire. Rich in grain, olives, and gold, it had long been one of the most stable Roman provinces. But it, too, was crumbling. The local Roman governor, Boniface, had rebelled against the imperial court in Ravenna and found himself facing an army he could not handle. According to some sources, Boniface invited the Vandals to aid him in exchange for land. Others claimed Gaiseric took advantage of Boniface's weakness without invitation. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. In 429 AD, Gaiseric led around 80,000 people, warriors, families, elderly, and slaves, across the Strait of Gibraltar. It was an unprecedented migration, less a raid than a relocation. The Vandals, once rootless wanderers, were now on the verge of something far greater: conquest. Their move into Africa would reshape the Western Mediterranean. It would mark the end of Roman dominance in the region and the birth of a new power. But it was not a peaceful transition. War, betrayal, and brutal sieges would follow. Still, by crossing the Rhine in 406, the Vandals had done more than just break through a frozen river. They had shattered a barrier that had once separated civilization from chaos, Rome from the barbarians. And as they made their way across Gaul, Hispania, and into Africa, they weren't merely invaders. They were kings in the making. When Gaiseric stepped ashore in North Africa in 429 AD, he wasn't just leading a tribe. He was leading a nation in exile. His people were weary from decades of war and wandering, but he had a vision. And unlike many warlords of his age, Gaiseric didn't just want to plunder. He wanted to rule. Roman Africa, however, wasn't going to hand itself over without a fight. The province was one of the empire's richest, responsible for much of the grain that fed Rome. Cities like Hippo Regius, Carthage, and Cirta were not dusty outposts, but bustling metropolises steeped in centuries of Roman culture. The governor Boniface, realizing he may have invited a force he couldn't control, tried to halt Gaiseric's advance. But it was too late. The war between Boniface's Roman forces and the Vandals quickly escalated into a brutal conflict. In 430, the Vandals laid siege to the city of Hippo Regius, where the great Christian bishop St. Augustine resided. Augustine, aged and ailing, watched as his city crumbled. He died that same year, and just months later, Hippo fell. It was a symbolic moment, the passing of an age. The spiritual voice of Rome's Christian order was gone, and a new power was moving in. Despite initial Roman resistance, Gaiseric's forces pushed steadily eastward. The Western Empire, distracted and divided, could not mount an effective counterattack. Ravenna, the imperial capital, eventually sent an envoy to negotiate peace. In 435, a treaty was signed that gave the Vandals control over parts of Mauritania and Numidia, the western regions of Roman Africa. But Gaiseric wasn't satisfied. He set his sights on Carthage, the jewel of North Africa and one of the most important cities in the entire Roman world. On October 19th, for 39, he made his move. Without warning, Vandal forces stormed the city. It fell quickly, almost shockingly so. The Roman fleet stationed there offered little resistance, and Gaiseric rode into Carthage not as a conqueror, but as a king. It was a stunning blow to the empire. Carthage had not been taken by force since it was destroyed by Scipio Aemilianus in 146 BC during the Third Punic War. For nearly 600 years, it had stood as a bastion of Roman power. Now, it belonged to the Vandals. From that moment forward, Gaiseric was no longer a tribal chieftain. He was the ruler of a kingdom, and what he built in Carthage was no mere encampment of nomads. It was an organized, functional state. Gaiseric kept many Roman institutions in place, including taxation systems and administrative structures. He minted coins, oversaw trade, and even created a formidable Vandal navy, the first true barbarian sea power to challenge Rome in the Mediterranean. But his rule was also marked by sharp religious divisions. The Vandals were Arian Christians, a sect considered heretical by the Nicene Catholic majority. Under Gaiseric, Catholic churches were seized, bishops were exiled, and religious persecution became state policy. While Gaiseric likely saw this as a political necessity, a way to break Catholic influence, it planted deep resentment among his Roman subjects. Even so, Gaiseric's power grew. He brokered marriages between his family and members of the Roman imperial household. In one stunning move, he even captured the Western Roman Empress Liciniia Eudoxia and her daughters after the Vandal sack of Rome in 455, a raid that would forever define his legacy. Yet Gaiseric was not reckless. He was calculating, preferring strategic alliances and naval superiority over constant warfare. His fleet harassed Roman coasts, raided Sicily, and even threatened Constantinople. He struck deals with both the Eastern and Western Roman empires, always on his own terms. He ruled for nearly 50 years, an astonishing reign in such turbulent times, and when he died in 477 AD, he left behind a fully functioning kingdom. A barbarian state had risen from the ruins of Rome, and its crown rested on the head of a Vandal. Gaiseric had done the unthinkable. He didn't just take land, he forged a legacy, a dynasty, a Vandal kingdom with courts, fleets, cities, and laws. And yet, within a few generations, that kingdom would begin to unravel, not from outside invasions, but from within. After the conquest of Carthage in 439 AD, the Vandals didn't burn to the ground. They built it back up, contrary to the image of them as savage destroyers. The Vandals transformed Carthage into the heart of a thriving kingdom that would last nearly a century. Under Gaiseric's rule and the kings who followed, Vandal Africa was not a wasteland ruin, but a land of wealth, order, and ambition. Carthage was already a jewel of the Mediterranean, a city with marble buildings, aqueducts, harbors, and a cosmopolitan population. Rather than destroy this infrastructure, the Vandals repurposed it. They moved into the palaces and homes once occupied by Roman elites. They took over the imperial bureaucracy, placing loyal Arian officials into key positions. Taxes were collected, trade resumed, and law was enforced. Gaiseric may have been a barbarian by Roman standards, but he understood the machinery of empire, and he used it expertly. The Vandal kingdom spanned from modern-day Morocco in the west to the borders of Egypt in the east. It included rich farmland, coastal cities, and vital ports. North Africa was still the breadbasket of the Western Mediterranean, and under Vandal control, that didn't change. Grain, olives, wine, and gold flowed from the fields into ships bound for Italy, the Eastern Empire, and beyond. One of the most astonishing features of Vandal Africa was its navy. Gaiseric had no Roman maritime training, yet he built a fleet that dominated the seas. For decades, Vandal ships roamed the Mediterranean, intercepting trade, raiding coastal cities, and even attacking Sicily, Corsica, and southern Italy. In an age where few powers could maintain naval dominance, the Vandals reigned supreme on water. But beneath the surface of the prosperity, tension simmered, especially around religion. The Vandals practiced Arian Christianity, which held a different view of Christ's nature than the Nicene Creed followed by most Romans. Arians believed Christ was created by God and therefore subordinate to him, while Nicene Christians, the majority in Roman Africa, believed in the Trinity, that Christ was co-equal and co-eternal with God. This theological divide was more than doctrine. It became political. Gaiseric and later Vandal kings persecuted Catholic Christians. Churches were seized and converted into Arian worship spaces. Bishops were exiled, sometimes tortured. Catholic councils were banned, and attempts to resist Vandal religious policy were met with harsh retaliation. While some of these actions were clearly meant to assert Arian dominance, they also served to suppress any Roman-led resistance. And yet, there's evidence that daily life for ordinary people in Vandal Africa was relatively stable. Roman laws remained in use, Latin was still spoken, and cities continued to thrive. The Vandals didn't try to erase Roman culture, they simply ruled over it. In many ways, it resembled the earlier Roman practice of absorbing conquered peoples into the imperial system. This coexistence, tension at the top, stability below, defined Vandal Africa. The ruling class, of course, was Vandal, a warrior elite. They kept their tribal identity alive through language, marriage, and tradition, but they were a minority in a sea of Latin-speaking, Nicene Christian Romans. The challenge of managing such a population without full integration would haunt the dynasty in the years to come. Still, during this golden period, roughly from 439 to 477, Vandal Africa was the most successful barbarian kingdom to emerge from the ruins of the Western Empire. While the Visigoths struggled in Spain and the Ostrogoths fought over Italy, the Vandals had peace, power, and prosperity. Gaiseric's death in 477 marked the end of an era, but his legacy was undeniable. He had done what no other barbarian leader had achieved: built a new Roman kingdom in Africa that stood on its own, not as a client of Rome, but as its rival. Carthage was reborn not as a Roman province, but as the capital of a Vandal empire. Its walls stood tall, its markets buzzed with trade, and its ships ruled the waves. But glory rarely lasts forever, and as we move into the reigns of Gaiseric's successors, we'll see how internal division, external pressure, and old Roman grudges began to unravel the kingdom he built. Gaiseric had ruled with an iron will, steering the Vandals through decades of war, diplomacy, and domination. But when he died in 477 AD, the question loomed: could his dynasty survive without him? He had tried to ensure it would. Gaiseric established a law of succession known as agnatic seniority, a system where power passed not from father to son, but from brother to brother. His aim was clear: keep the throne within his bloodline while preventing child kings or contested regencies. But such systems often bred rivalry, not stability. The first to inherit the crown was his son, Huneric, who had long acted as co-ruler and heir apparent. A tall, imposing man known for his stern nature and religious fanaticism, Huneric lacked his father's cunning diplomacy. What he brought instead was a ruthless commitment to stamping out opposition, particularly from the Catholic population. Under Huneric's rule, the Vandal kingdom took a dark turn. He initiated one of the most severe persecutions of Nicene Christians in the Western Mediterranean. Catholic bishops were summoned under the pretense of theological debate, only to be harassed, banished, or worse. Churches were closed, monasteries destroyed, and Catholic clergy tortured. A few were even burned alive or mutilated. His reign, from 477 to 484, was marked by fear and religious terror. Yet even amid these brutal policies, Huneric kept the administrative core of the kingdom intact. Trade continued. The navy remained strong. Coins bearing his name circulated throughout the region. But the spiritual and cultural divide between the Vandal elite and their Roman subjects widened into a chasm. When Huneric died, possibly poisoned, his cousin Gundamund ascended the throne. Gundamund attempted to soften the kingdom's harsh religious stance, easing persecution and trying to restore some degree of harmony. Though still an Arian Christian, he allowed some Catholic bishops to return and halted mass violence. His reign from 484 to 496 was relatively peaceful, a needed respite from his predecessor's heavy hand. But Gundamund faced other challenges. The Eastern Roman Empire, under Emperor Zeno, was watching the Vandals closely, though Gaiseric had maintained delicate relations with both the Eastern and Western empires. That balance was now gone. The Byzantines considered the Vandal kingdom an illegal occupation of Roman lands. Zeno began quietly encouraging rebellion in Africa, offering support to Catholic resistance groups and exiled clergy. The noose was beginning to tighten. Following Gundamund's death, the crown passed to Thrasimund, another of Gaiseric's grandsons. He ruled from 496 to 523 and is remembered as one of the most cultured of the Vandal kings. A patron of the arts and a lover of classical learning, Thrasimund wanted to repair the Vandal image, especially in the eyes of Rome. He ended active persecution of Catholics and welcomed back many Roman elites who had fled. Under his reign, Carthage flourished once more, and for a brief moment, it seemed the Vandal state might stabilize. But the peace was an illusion. Internally, tension still simmered between Arian Vandals and their majority Roman Catholic subjects. The succession law that had once kept the dynasty united now caused rifts among rival claimants. Meanwhile, Vandal nobility, once hardened warriors, had grown complacent, detached from the challenges rising just across the sea. The most serious threat, however, came from Constantinople. The Eastern Roman Empire was preparing something no Vandal king could have anticipated: a full-scale reconquest of Africa. Under the leadership of a new emperor, Justinian I, and his brilliant general Belisarius, the Eastern Empire would launch an ambitious campaign to restore Rome's former glory. But for now, the Vandals still held their throne. From the harbors of Carthage to the walls of Hippo, their banner flew, a symbol of barbarian royalty, of defiant survival in a Roman world. Gaisieric's dream endured through his descendants, but their throne, once forged in conquest, now sat upon a fault line, one that would soon crack open beneath their feet. By the early 6th century, the Vandal kingdom in North Africa stood as a paradox, strong on the surface, but vulnerable at its core. The city still functioned, trade routes hummed, and kings ruled from the refurbished palaces of Carthage. But under the golden facade, cracks were spreading. To the east, in the glistening marble halls of Constantinople, Emperor Justinian I had a vision, a grand imperial ambition to reunite the fractured Roman world. He believed the Roman Empire wasn't dead, merely dismembered, and his mission, backed by the vast wealth of the Eastern Empire and a zealous Christian court, was simple: reclaim what had been lost. Africa was at the top of that list. From a Roman perspective, Vandal rule was an embarrassment, an open wound that never healed. The fact that barbarian kings ruled Carthage, once a gleaming Roman city, was not just a strategic threat. It was an ideological insult. Moreover, the religious divide fueled Constantinople's cause. The Vandal kings were Arians, deemed heretics by Orthodox Christianity, and their mistreatment of Catholic populations in Africa gave Justinian a convenient justification for invasion, a holy war disguised as political reunification. The man who would carry out this imperial mission was Belisarius, a young and brilliant general from the Balkans. Known for his discipline, tactical creativity, and iron loyalty to Justinian, Belisarius had already proven himself in earlier campaigns. Now, in 533 AD, he was entrusted with the most daring operation yet: sail across the Mediterranean, crush the Vandals, and restore North Africa to Rome. It was a staggering gamble. The Eastern Empire had not mounted an overseas invasion of this scale in generations. They had to assemble a fleet of over 500 ships, transport cavalry, infantry, supplies, and siege weapons, and launch a coordinated assault across dangerous waters. The risks were enormous: storms, mutiny, Vandal naval resistance. But fortune, as it often did in the story, favored the bold. Back in Carthage, the reigning Vandal king was Gelimer, great-grandson of Gaiseric. Intelligent and proud, Gelimer had come to power through a coup, deposing and blinding his cousin Hilderic, a pro-Roman king who had tried to restore peace with Constantinople and improve relations with the local Catholic population. Justinian seized upon this internal conflict as a pretext for war, declaring that he was restoring the legitimate king. Gelimer knew an invasion was possible, but he underestimated the speed and precision with which Belisarius would strike. The Vandal kingdom had grown complacent, its military idle for decades, its navy poorly maintained. Gone were the days of Gaiseric's razor-sharp fleets dominating the sea. In September 533, Belisarius landed near Capet in modern-day Tunisia, almost unopposed. Marching quickly, he encountered minimal resistance from Vandal outposts. Gelimer scrambled to raise an army, but it was too little, too late. The two forces met at the Battle of Ad Decimum, just outside Carthage. In a moment of historical irony, the site of the battle was only a few miles from where Hannibal had once camped during the Second Punic War. The Vandal army was fractured and poorly coordinated. Though Gelimer fought valiantly, the outcome was decisive. The Vandals were routed, and Belisarius entered Carthage without serious resistance. The city, incredibly, remained intact. The Romans had retaken it nearly a century after losing it to Gaiseric, without so much as a siege. But Gelimer was not done. Retreating to the interior mountains, he rallied his remaining forces and prepared for a final stand. The Vandals, once kings of the sea, now hid among the hills, clinging to the last embers of their fading dynasty. This was more than just a war between empires. It was a reckoning. The ghost of Rome had returned, wearing a new face, speaking with an orthodox tongue, and backed by imperial gold. And the Vandals, once feared and admired, now stood alone, with no allies, no fleet, and no hope of rescue. The dream of Gaiseric, the kingdom forged by fire and blood, was about to meet its end, not in a climactic blaze, but in a quiet, crushing collapse. For nearly a century, the Vandals had ruled from Carthage, as kings, as conquerors, as self-made emperors of Roman Africa. But in the space of a few months in 533 AD, it all came crashing down. What took Gaiseric decades to build collapsed in less than a year. The initial blow came at the Battle of Ad Decimum, where General Belisarius, leading the Eastern Roman forces, scattered the Vandal army just outside the city. Gelimer's attempt to coordinate a three-pronged ambush fell apart under pressure and poor communication. His brother, Amadas, was killed early in the clash, and the Vandal lines disintegrated. After the battle, Belisarius marched into Carthage unopposed. The city that had once defied Rome now opened its gates to him, its people welcoming the Eastern Romans as liberators. For the citizens of Carthage, many still culturally Roman and devoutly Catholic, it was a restoration, not an invasion. Decades of tension under Vandal rule, especially the religious persecution of Catholics, had left a bitter taste. Now, with Gelimer retreating and the empire reborn in the east, many saw Justinian's troops as a return to the old order. But Gelimer wasn't finished yet. After the loss at Ad Decimum, he regrouped in Numidia, the rugged highlands west of Carthage. There, he rallied the remnants of his forces and even managed to secure support from Berber tribes still loyal to the Vandal crown. His hope was to launch a counterattack and retake Carthage before Belisarius could consolidate power. It was a desperate gamble. The Vandal navy, once the pride of Gaiseric's empire, was gone, destroyed or captured. Communications between the Vandal forces were unreliable, and their once disciplined military was a shadow of its former self. Still, Gelimer pressed forward, determined to strike before Belisarius was reinforced. The two sides met again in December 533, at the Battle of Tricamarum, the final major engagement of the Vandalic War. Gelimer's forces fought hard, but the Byzantines, better trained and better organized, quickly overwhelmed them. Another of Gelimer's brothers, Zazo, was killed in battle. Upon seeing his brother's body fall, Gelimer's will to fight broke. He fled into the mountains with a handful of loyal followers, hiding among the Berbers for several months. It was a humiliating reversal. A king once feared across the Mediterranean, now reduced to a fugitive in his own land. But even in defeat, Gelimer remained composed. When he finally surrendered to Belisarius in early 534, it was under dignified terms. The Roman general treated him with respect, as an adversary worthy of recognition. Gelimer was offered land and a pension in Galatia, in modern-day Turkey. But before leaving Africa, he is said to have uttered a final, haunting phrase, one borrowed from the Bible. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. With Gelimer's capture, the Vandal kingdom ceased to exist. Carthage was restored to the empire, and Justinian wasted no time integrating it into the Byzantine administration. Orthodox churches were reopened, Arian clergy were expelled, and Roman officials were placed in charge of the provinces. The Vandals, once kings of a flourishing African empire, were now landless, scattered, and forgotten. There was no grand resistance, no underground Vandal rebellion, no heroic last stand. It was as if the dynasty had been swallowed whole by history, consumed by the very world it had tried to conquer. Some Vandal nobles were absorbed into the Byzantine aristocracy. Others faded into local populations, intermarrying, changing names, and vanishing into silence. The collapse was complete. In less than a year, an entire kingdom had been erased, not just from the map, but from memory. And yet, the Vandals had not simply vanished. Their blood still flowed to the people of North Africa. Their influence lingered in laws, cityscapes, and legends. But their name, twisted and tarnished, would endure in another way. A word once meaning kings and conquerors would soon come to mean only one thing: destruction. When the dust settled after the Byzantine reconquest of North Africa, the question arose, what happened to the Vandals? A dynasty that had ruled for almost a century, that had challenged Rome and created a maritime empire, seemed to vanish as if they had never existed. Historians have long puzzled over this disappearance. Unlike the Visigoths, who endured in Hispania, or the Ostrogoths, who left a mark on Italy, the Vandals left behind no lasting legacy of nationhood, no surviving language, no distinct culture that continued past their fall. Their erasure was swift, deliberate, and disturbingly thorough. The Byzantine Empire played a significant role in that disappearance. Emperor Justinian's campaign to reunite the Roman world was not just about reclaiming land. It was about restoring ideology. The Vandal kingdom represented a blasphemy to Constantinople, a heretical, barbarian state that dared to occupy what was, in Roman eyes, eternally theirs. After their conquest, the Byzantines enacted a comprehensive program of denandalization. Cities and temples were rededicated to Orthodox Christianity. Public inscriptions, statues, and monuments bearing the names of Vandal kings were destroyed or overwritten. Arian churches were closed, and many Vandal nobles were either executed or forcibly relocated to distant provinces in Asia Minor. Their estates were confiscated, their titles erased, and their very identity dissolved. The Vandal elite disappeared into exile, some fading into Byzantine society, others killed in later purges. The ordinary Vandal population, warriors, settlers, artisans, farmers, were simply absorbed into the broader Berber and Roman populations. Within a few generations, the distinct markers of Vandal ethnicity and language had been diluted to the point of invisibility. One key factor in their disappearance was their small numbers. The Vandals, even at their peak, were a ruling minority. Modern historians estimate they number around 80,000 people, including women, children, and non-combatants, when they crossed into Africa in 429 AD. Ruling over millions of Latin-speaking Roman subjects, they never developed a strong cultural infrastructure of their own. They built no new cities, established no universities, and left behind few literary works. Their cultural output was minimal, and their oral traditions were lost with time. Even their language, Vandalic, a Germanic tongue closely related to Gothic, has vanished almost entirely. Only a handful of Vandalic words survive: names, military terms, fragments, and religious texts. Unlike Gothic, which left a written Bible, Vandalic was never formally recorded. When the speakers disappeared, so too did the language. Roman historians, especially those writing under Byzantine patronage, further ensured their legacy would be remembered with contempt. Procopius, Justinian's court historian, painted the Vandals as decadent, cruel, and effeminate, indulging in luxuries they didn't deserve, persecuting the righteous, and lacking the martial virtues of their ancestors. He portrayed their court as a hotbed of vice and their fall as divine justice. By the time of the early Middle Ages, Vandal had become a byword for destruction, not because of anything the Vandals had actually done, but because they had dared to sack Rome in 455 AD. That symbolic act, though relatively restrained compared to other sieges, became central to how they were remembered. Later generations, especially during the Renaissance and Enlightenment, looked back at Rome's fall with horror and needed someone to blame. The Vandals, conveniently foreign, heretical, and vanished, became the perfect scapegoats. And so, a complex people, with kings, courts, navies, and laws, were reduced to a word, a slur, a shorthand for chaos. They had ruled for nearly 100 years. They had built a kingdom out of nothing. But without a written history of their own, their story became someone else's to tell. And that someone was Rome. But if we look closely at the ruins of Carthage, at coins with Vandal inscriptions, at the faint traces of Vandal DNA in North African populations, we can still glimpse the shadows of forgotten dynasty. Not gone, just buried. When you hear the word Vandal, what do you picture? A hooded figure spray painting a wall? A mob smashing statues? A senseless act of destruction? That association didn't come from the Vandals themselves. It came from history written by their enemies. The transformation of the Vandal name into a synonym for destruction is one of the most enduring and deliberate acts of historical defamation in Western memory. It's a powerful example how victors write history and how they can twist a people's legacy to fit a narrative of conquest, morality, and superiority. Let's go back to the sack of Rome in 455 AD, the event that sealed the Vandals' fate in the historical imagination. After the death of the Western Roman Emperor Valentinian III, Carthage and Rome had a fragile alliance, brokered through marriage between Gaiseric's son and Valentinian's daughter. When that alliance unraveled and political assassinations rocked Rome, Gaiseric launched a naval expedition to the Eternal City. Rome was poorly defended, politically fractured, and militarily weak. When Gaiseric's fleet landed, Pope Leo I met the king and negotiated a peaceful entry in exchange for the city's safety. There was no massacre, no razing of temples, no wholesale destruction of infrastructure. In fact, many contemporary sources note that the Vandals did far less damage than other invaders had done or would do later. But the optics, a barbarian king entering Rome and stripping of treasure, were too potent to forget. In the centuries that followed, especially in Christian and Enlightenment-era Europe, this event became mythologized. Vandal no longer meant a member of a Germanic tribe. It meant someone who destroys art, order, or civilization. The term vandalism was coined in the 18th century during the French Revolution. It was used by the Bishop of Blois, Henri Gregoire, to condemn revolutionaries who were destroying royal and religious monuments. He chose the word vandalism not because it reflected any particular act by the actual Vandals, but because their name, already tainted by centuries of Roman and Byzantine propaganda, fit the rhetorical purpose to evoke horror at the destruction of beauty and tradition. From there, the term embedded itself into European languages and education systems. School children were taught that the Vandals were savage destroyers of civilization. Art critics used the term to mock modern artists. Politicians invoked it to condemn protesters. And history quietly accepted the slander. But the truth is this: the Vandals were not uniquely violent or destructive. They were no more ruthless than Rome's own generals, who often sacked cities, executed civilians, and enslaved populations. They built a kingdom that lasted a century, with working institutions, trade, currency, and law. They commissioned architecture, ran schools, and maintained order, often more effectively than the collapsing Western Empire they replaced. So, why were they demonized so completely? Part of the answer lies in religion. The Vandals were Arian Christians in a world increasingly dominated by Nicene orthodoxy. Their persecution of Catholic clergy, especially under kings like Gaiseric, gave Roman chroniclers all the moral ammunition they needed. Writers like Victor Vita, a Catholic bishop in Africa, painted the Vandals as cruel heretics and moral degenerates. His stories became the basis for later histories that amplified their worst qualities and ignored their accomplishments. Another reason lies in politics and cultural pride. Later European empires saw themselves as heirs to Rome. They wanted to glorify Roman civilization and demonize those who had opposed it. What better villain than a barbarian people who sacked Rome and then disappeared, leaving no one to defend their memory? Today, historians are slowly working to correct that record. Modern archaeology, critical reevaluation of sources, and a growing interest in forgotten empires are all helping to peel back the layers of myth. The Vandals were not vandals. They were warriors, settlers, rulers, and dreamers, a displaced people who seized an empire and ruled it with both strength and ambition. Their fall was not the triumph of civilization over savagery, but a tragic reminder that history often favors those who control the pen. Long after the fall of Carthage and the exile of Gelimer, the world moved on, but the Vandals remained, buried beneath layers of myth, misinterpretation, and silence. For centuries, their dynasty was remembered not through their achievements, but through the insult they supposedly inspired. But now, as modern historians, archaeologists, and storytellers sift through the ruins, a new picture is beginning to emerge. One more complex, more human, and far more compelling. So what do we really know about the legacy of the Vandal kings? First, their physical traces remain, faint but real. In North Africa, particularly in modern-day Tunisia, excavations have uncovered Vandal-era buildings, mosaics, and coinage. These artifacts show a high level of administrative continuity from Roman Africa into the Vandal period. Roads were maintained. Villas were occupied. Aqueducts and baths continued to function. In some regions, life for ordinary citizens may have changed very little from Roman to Vandal rule, at least until the later years of religious persecution. Carthage itself, once reduced to a minor port after the Punic Wars, was revived under Vandal rule. It again became a capital, not of an empire, but of a kingdom. Gaiseric's palace likely stood where earlier Roman governors ruled, and he minted his own coins, bearing his image and royal titles, a clear sign that the Vandals didn't see themselves as squatters, but sovereigns. And yet, they left few written records. We have no surviving Vandal literature, no royal annals, no preserved epics or chronicles. What we know comes from Roman and Byzantine sources, often biased, usually hostile. Even archaeology offers only whispers. No tombs of Vandal kings have been positively identified. Gaiseric's final resting place, like that of many of his descendants, remains unknown. Did they receive Roman-style burials with stone markers? Or were their graves unmarked, hidden from history as their dynasty was erased? There are tantalizing clues. In Tabarka, Tunisia, a discovery of Vandal-era sarcophagi suggests elite burials from the time of their rule. Inscriptions in Latin, with names potentially linked to Vandal nobles, hint that these kings saw themselves not as alien invaders, but as rightful rulers of Roman land. And perhaps they were. Gaiseric didn't just sack cities. He built a multi-ethnic kingdom, balancing Roman administration, Berber alliances, and Vandal aristocracy. He ruled for nearly 50 years, an extraordinary reign in the most volatile century of late antiquity. His successors, despite their flaws, maintained the kingdom for generations. Even after the fall, Vandal influence lingered. Some of their laws were copied by the Byzantines. Their naval tactics influenced later Mediterranean powers. And in pockets of North Africa, Aryan Christian communities survived long enough to echo the memory of a time when the Vandals ruled. But perhaps the greatest legacy the Vandals leave behind is a question, not about destruction, but about identity. How do we remember those who leave no written voice? Who tells the story of the conquered? And how many other forgotten kings have disappeared beneath the judgments of their enemies? In many ways, the Vandals were victims of historical identity theft. They were real people with lives, politics, faiths, and dreams. But the narrative was hijacked. They became villains in someone else's tale, reduced to stereotypes so powerful it warped their very name. Now, as we revisit their story, from the frozen Rhine to the shores of Africa, from the siege of Carthage to the silence of exile, we begin to reclaim a lost chapter of human history, not just the rise and fall of a kingdom, but the resilience of a people, a story not of Vandals, but of visionaries. The Vandal kings ruled for 100 years, and now, finally, their story is being unearthed, piece by piece, ruin by ruin, truth by truth, not forgotten, just waiting to be remembered. If the story of vanished royalty fascinated you, subscribe to the Crit Stories and uncover more hidden empires, dark legends, and lost truths. Don't just read history, rediscover it.